Hello everyone and welcome to Royals at the Ranch, the series where we discuss the behavior, temperament, and trainability of Python Regis. I am Lori with Spirit Keeper Equine Sanctuary. This is Sarek, one of our Royals at the Ranch, and we would like to welcome you to episode 7. Royals at the Ranch, episode 7, The Escape. All right, here's the story so far. I'm just going to give you a quick recap of days 1 through 3 of Amunette and Amun's time here. As we discussed in the last episode, Amun and Amunette arrived here in March of 2020 for a preference testing study to look at habitat preference, or more specifically, if the snakes would prefer to spend more time in rack-style bins or pseudo-naturalistic habitat enclosures. And the first 36 hours, I observed stress behaviors, stereotypies, and I decided to move both snakes into Chondro Tubs. And if you're confused as to what that is, I went over that in the last episode. And I also did a Serpente Sunday where I went over what Chondro Tubs are. So you can watch those, and I will link all of these other videos I'm talking about in the video description of this episode. The behaviors I saw in the bins included edging, pacing, nose pushing, face rubbing, striking, and hyperactivity in general. When both snakes were moved into the Chondro Tubs during night number 2 here, all of the stress behaviors stopped and the stereotypies ceased, and that was immediately. I didn't have to give it any time at all. So from hour 36 and into day 4, I observed the following behaviors from both snakes. They were climbing up and down, perching, hanging down in ambush postures, using rectilinear locomotion on the ground. They were resting on ledges, specifically the ledge above the door. They spent a lot of time up there. They climbed around the roof area of the Chondro Tubs. They were draping on ledges and on top of their humid hide, and they were resting in hides during the day or hiding on that ledge above their door. So this is what happened day 4 and an example of how I kept my written logs. So on March 27th, 2020, these are my actual journal notes from midnight that day through 1800 hours or 6 p.m. that night. So at midnight, the male was climbing at the enclosure top along the ledge above the door and onto perches. The female was climbing from the floor up the back wall. The male fell into the water dish, and now that I was observing him and writing these notes, he was climbing back upwards. At 0100 hours, both snakes were resting on the ledges above their doors. At 0400 hours, the male was on the ledge above his door and the female was in the coconut hide on the ground. And then at 0600, 0700, 0800, 0900, and at 1000 hours, I wrote ditto. And that means that they were doing the exact same thing as they were doing at 0400. The male was on the ledge above his door, and the female was resting in the coconut hide on the ground. At 1600 hours on the 27th, that's 4 p.m., they were both on the ledges above their doors. And at 1700 and 1800, I wrote ditto. That means when I did my round of checks, they were still on the ledges above their door. All right, now at 2200 hours through midnight, here's what happened. At 2200 hours, that's 10 p.m., the male was climbing and the female was missing. Yes. Missing, female missing. She was not in her Chondro tub. I took the lid off, I opened the front door, I took everything out, and she was not in her Chondro tub. So I searched for her for what seemed like hours, and I actually have told people that I searched for her for several hours, and then when I look back at my journal notes to do this video, I see that it was actually only 40 minutes that I searched for her, but believe me, it seemed like hours. So, succumbing to the paradigm that I had always heard, I started looking on the floor and looking underneath things and looking in the closet, and I was just exhausted after what seemed like hours, but apparently was only 40 minutes. I decided I needed to rest, and I laid down on a futon couch that I had in the room at the time. And I laid my head back and looked up at the ceiling, and there she was. That's right, at 2240 hours, that's 10:40 p.m., the male was perching in his Chondro tub, and I found the female climbing behind these boaphile enclosures up near the ceiling and above cage number 4. And she was between the cage and the wall, and she was kind of hanging over the top looking right at me. And I thought, I'm sure you've been up there this whole time that I've been looking for you, and I never thought to look up. Now, these boaphile enclosures are 4 feet long by 2 feet deep by 18 inches high. And at the time, they were on a 12-inch stand. And that's what you see Amunette crawling in front of on the floor, is the stand for the boaphile enclosures and the bottom enclosure. So these enclosures went all the way almost up to the ceiling. They were just a few inches from the ceiling, and she was all the way on top of those, just hanging out and probably laughing at me in her head about all of my distress looking for her and me searching all over the floor and thinking at that point that she'd for sure gone down the vent, because the vents at this point still weren't covered. They just had the normal open slatted vent cover. And since then, I have put screens, just like window screen material, over all of our floor vents so that the snakes cannot get down into them. All right, so at 23:20 hours, they were both in their chondro tubs, and they were both on the ledges above their doors. And I made a note that I duct taped the bottoms of both chondro tubs where the door swings down, because I was pretty sure that's how she got out. And I don't know why I didn't do that immediately, but it looks like I waited from 22:40 when I found her to 23:20 to put the duct tape on. But that may have been because I did have her out and handling her a little bit. The photograph you see on the top right is me holding her right after I found her, and I was just so thankful that I'd found her. I held her for a little while. And then the next morning, just as a note, the male was on the ledge above his door, and the female was coiled on the floor underneath her paper towels. So she wasn't even in a hide the next morning. She was under her paper towels. So I don't know if she had tried to get out the bottom of the door again and just got exhausted and decided she'd crawl under the paper towels and hide, but that's where she was the next morning. All right, now it's time for our behavior break of this episode, where you are going to hear about Royal Python temperament. In this behavior break for episode 7 of Royals at the Ranch, we're going to talk about temperament. Temperament is a set of characteristics. They're stable biological tendencies that are innate to every individual. These characteristics appear early, they're heritable, and they are a result of neural functioning within the brain. Organisms are born with temperament tendencies. That means that everyone, whether human or non-human animal, is born either on the shy or bold end of a temperament spectrum or a reactive proactive end of a temperament spectrum, just to give you an example. And even though we may be able to change how shy we are over our lifetime through learning and experience and working really hard, we are always going to have that tendency to remain innately shy. So temperament is one of the foundations of personality, and personality is something that develops over time as organisms learn and grow and gain experiences. So consistent behaviors across time and context are what are defined as personality traits. And there's a learned component to that. So personality includes not just temperament, but also the learned component, which are these personality traits that emerge through experience and learning. Just to give you a little bit of background, temperament research in snakes and lizards has been done, and that includes in royal pythons. I'm going to talk in just a moment about a study specifically that included Python regius. But studies have produced evidence of behavioral consistency within individuals over time, behavioral consistency across situations, that there is a heritable basis for behavior, that temperament generalities exist within a species. And that means that all animals within a species tend to have general temperament traits in common, that there is variability between different species. So not all species of snakes have the same temperament tendencies, not all species of canids will have the same temperament tendencies, etc. And there is an occurrence of outliers within each species. So those are going to be individuals with behavior outside the norm for their species. So some of the research findings are that temperament traits in snakes are similar to those in other vertebrates. There are 5 basic traits that are commonly looked at in temperament studies: shyness and boldness, avoidance and exploration, activity, sociability, and conspecific aggression. That means aggressiveness or agonistic behavior between members of your same species. For instance, in a paper by Brashears et al. In 2019, researchers found that threat responses could be generalized for a species, with variability possible among individuals within a species. The default anti-predator behavior for Bismarck ringed pythons was to coil and strike. In children's pythons was to flee, except for one individual, which you could call an outlier, who consistently did a striking behavior. And then in royal pythons, the default behavior to a perceived threat was to ball up and hide their head within their coils. Let's talk a little bit about a couple of specific things. Variability among individuals within a species are what we call outliers. So if you look at the green arrow here, I have it pointing to a snake. His name is Sarek. He's an outlier among Python regius because he's very bold, he's proactive, he's outgoing, he's inquisitive, he's curious, he's awake much of the time during the day as well as at night. He doesn't fit the typical temperament tendencies of the rest of his species. And that would be this bottom bullet point you see, where royal pythons tend to ball up, hide their heads within their coils, because they tend to be on the shy end of the temperament spectrum. And that is typical for the species. If temperament and personality is something that you have an interest in regards to Python regius and other snakes, this upcoming Serpentes Sunday episode is going to be a whole mini class that's about 15 or 20 minutes long on temperament and personality in snakes. So I hope you'll join me for that. Before I talk about next time on Royals at the Ranch and what we're going to see in episode 8, if you look behind me, you can see the habitats for Amun and Amunet. Amun is in the top one, and you can see him hanging out of his favorite cave and over the edge of his habitat threshold. And Amunet is on the bottom doing the same thing. I don't know if you can see her. She's kind of dark and she's just more difficult to see. So I thought that I would give you a glimpse of them before I tell you about Royals at the Ranch episode 8, which you can look forward to next week. Okay, I'm back. In episode 8 of Royals at the Ranch, it's not going to be a typical episode that you've become used to. It is going to be an actual video that I filmed back in April of 2021 of Fulcrum arriving and being placed into quarantine. Now, Fulcrum is the snake that you see in this photograph, and you see him pictured as I saw him prior to purchase. This is his rack bin that he lived in on plain white paper with a water dish from the time he was hatched until he was 5.5 years old, at which point he came here. He arrived in April of 2021. I placed him into a quarantine bin, which you're going to see in the video, and I've been slowly acclimating him to a new life. He is still in that same quarantine bin, but it's been moved to one of the snake rooms. In fact, it's in this room that I'm in now. And I am doing choice-based handling with him, and he has started to come out of his enclosure on his own from time to time. In fact, he's out of his enclosure right now, somewhere in the room. Yes, I know for sure he's in the room. I'm pretty sure that he's actually on top of and behind these enclosures that are just behind me. But I'm not going to force him out. He was climbing around earlier, and I left for a few minutes and came back, and I could hear him back there, but I couldn't see him. So you've seen him in other videos, though. You've seen me holding him, and he was in our premiere episode, episode 1 of Royals at the Ranch, where I had him outside with the horses. So he isn't doing badly. He's acclimating somewhat. However, he hasn't eaten yet. So he's been here since April. This is August 2021, and he hasn't eaten. But I'm fairly happy with his other behavior, and he has since been to the vet and had a complete vet check. So I have a second video that I filmed about Fulcrum, and that was when we arrived back from his vet check. But the episode you're going to see next week, if you're one of my Patreon subscribers, you've already seen it because I aired it right away as soon as it was filmed for the folks who subscribe to my Patreon. And if you're not one of my Patreon subscribers, then you are going to be taking a jump back in time a few months and seeing it for the first time. Either way, I hope you enjoy it, and we will jump back into our regular story after this Fulcrum episode next week.